For 17 hours, Clara Hensley was dead, but when she woke up, her first words were a blood-curdling scream about the horrors she saw in the afterlife. The doctors were stunned. This had never happened before. Family and friends stood frozen as Clara's voice trembled with fear, warning of something unimaginable waiting beyond death. Could her chilling experience be real, or was it something else entirely? Tune in as we reveal her shocking message that caused Pope Francis to travel to the U.S. and see the case for himself. A quiet life turned upside down. Clara's life had been shaped by routine. She had her morning coffee, always black, no sugar, before walking to work, her steps crunching on the gravel path she'd taken 1,000 times before. Her evenings were spent reading by the window, a stray cat often curling up at her feet. If you'd asked anyone in Willowbrook about Clara, they'd likely shrug and say, "She's nice," before moving on to discuss something more interesting. But Clara had her own depth, her own unspoken dreams and fears that she rarely shared. She longed for something more, something beyond the endless cycles of days that blurred into each other. Yet she never acted on it. She kept her thoughts tucked away, believing that longing for more was for people with boldness she didn't possess. Before we delve into this, it's clear that her experience wasn't just unusual. It was far darker than anyone could have imagined, and this won't be the only revelation that will leave you shaken. Everything changed one Friday evening in late October. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, carpeting the ground in fiery hues. A librarian had just finished locking up the library when it happened. She felt a sudden piercing pain in her chest, like a weight pressing down, squeezing the breath out of her lungs. She staggered, her hand gripping the library's iron railing for support. A passerby, Mrs. Beauchamp, a sprightly retiree who walked her dog along Main Street every evening, noticed the pale face and rushed to her side. "Are you all right, dear?" she'd asked, though the look in her eyes made it clear something was terribly wrong. The librarian tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. And then she collapsed. By the time the ambulance arrived, a small crowd had gathered. People whispered among themselves, the soft hum of their concern punctuated by the wail of the approaching siren. She was loaded onto a stretcher, her lifeless body a stark contrast to the lively, colorful evening surrounding her. The paramedics worked frantically, administering CPR and checking her vitals as they rushed her to Willowbrook General Hospital. News of the collapse spread through the town like wildfire. At the hospital, her parents arrived in a state of disbelief, their faces etched with worry. Her mother, a retired school teacher, clutched a tissue in her trembling hands while her father paced the waiting room, his boots echoing against the tiled floor. Co-workers from the library also showed up, their quiet sobs filling the room as they exchanged stories about her gentle nature and quick smile. Meanwhile, the doctors worked tirelessly in the emergency room. Her heart had stopped for several minutes, and though they managed to revive her, her condition was critical. The head physician, Dr. Patel, stepped out to speak with her family, his expression grim. "She's in a coma," he explained, "and we're not sure if she'll wake up." His words hung heavy in the air, a cruel punctuation to the hope they had clung to. But the most chilling moment came later that night, when her heart stopped again. This time, the monitors flatlined, their sharp beeping replaced by a single, unending tone. The medical team sprang into action, their movements practiced yet desperate. Time seemed to slow as the seconds stretched on. 5 minutes passed, then 10. By all accounts, she was gone. Her family was ushered into a quiet room where a nurse tried to offer some semblance of comfort. Friends cried openly, their grief raw and unfiltered. But as they mourned, something unexplainable happened in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of the hospital room. Her body, cold and still moments before, twitched. It was subtle at first, a small jerk of her hand that went unnoticed by the exhausted medical team. Then, her chest rose, a deep gasp shattering the oppressive quiet. Doctors rushed back in, their disbelief written across their faces. Against all odds, Her heart started beating again. The beeping of the monitor returned, tentative and uneven but unmistakably alive. She had been clinically dead for over 15 minutes, her body deprived of oxygen for a time no one thought survivable. Yet here she was, drawing breath once more. The news of her revival was both miraculous and unsettling. In a town like Willowbrook, where the unusual rarely happened, people didn't quite know how to process it. Was it divine intervention, a medical anomaly, or something else entirely? Whispers circulated as people speculated, their imaginations running wild with possibilities. The church held a special prayer service, while skeptics dismissed it as luck or a misdiagnosis. But those who had seen her in those moments, her pale skin, her lifeless form, knew it was more than that. She herself, though still unconscious, seemed to bear the weight of her ordeal. Her once serene face was now marked by a furrowed brow, as if she were wrestling with something unseen. Nurses reported strange occurrences in her room, a flickering light that couldn't be fixed, the sudden chill that made them shiver despite the warm air. Her parents stayed by her side, their hands clasped in silent prayer as they waited for her to wake up. The world had shifted for her and for everyone around her. The life she had known, the routine, the quiet existence, was gone. Whatever came next, it was bound to be unlike anything she or Willowbrook had ever experienced. And as her fingers twitched once more, as if reaching for something beyond comprehension, the feeling that this was only the beginning settled over the room like a shadow. Before we go any further, let's make one thing clear. What happened wasn't just strange, it was terrifying, and it's only going to get darker from here. The hospital room grew quieter after her revival, but that silence was fleeting. It didn't take long for the whispers and confusion to turn into shock. Just hours after her miraculous return, her pulse began to weaken again. Her breathing slowed to a crawl, her chest barely rising until it stopped completely. The machines screamed their sharp alarms as her body went still once more. Doctors rushed to confirm the unthinkable. She was gone, this time without question. For 17 long hours, she was declared clinically dead. In those moments after the second declaration, there was a strange calm that settled over the room. It wasn't the peaceful kind, though. It was the eerie, heavy quiet that felt unnatural, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The attending nurse turned off the machines one by one, their constant beeps fading into silence. Dr. Patel, who had been hopeful earlier, shook his head and muttered something about how unpredictable life could be. Her parents wept openly, their cries echoing down the sterile halls. Her mother clung to her hand, unwilling to let go, while her father leaned against the wall, his head bowed in silent despair. Then came the strange occurrences. At first, they were subtle, barely noticeable amidst the grief and chaos. A flicker of the overhead light that seemed too rhythmic to be a coincidence. A cold draft swept through the room, making the nurses shiver even though the thermostat read a comfortable temperature. One of the medical interns swore they felt the faintest vibration beneath their feet, like the hum of an engine far below the hospital. None of these things seemed connected, yet together they created an atmosphere that was anything but ordinary. As the hours stretched on, her body remained where it was, awaiting transfer to the morgue. Nurses avoided the room unless absolutely necessary, their unease palpable. The few who dared enter described feeling watched, though the room was empty apart from her. One nurse, a seasoned professional who had seen her share of tragedy, swore she heard a faint sigh coming from her direction. She laughed it off nervously, blaming exhaustion, but her unease lingered. Outside the hospital, a storm had begun to brew. Dark clouds gathered over Willowbrook, casting the small town in an ominous shadow. The wind howled through the streets, rattling windows and sending leaves skittering across the ground. It was as if nature itself had sensed the strangeness unfolding within the hospital walls. The storm's timing didn't go unnoticed by Clara's parents, who sat huddled together in the waiting area. Her mother murmured prayers, her words trembling with desperation, while her father stared out the window, his eyes unblinking. Inside the room, things grew even stranger. The flickering lights became more pronounced, dancing like they were caught in an invisible wind. The draft turned icy, enough to make anyone's breath visible if they stayed long enough. A nurse who came to prepare Clara for the transport felt her hair stand on end as soon as she crossed the threshold. She worked quickly, her hands trembling as she avoided looking directly at Clara's face. "It's just a body," she whispered to herself, but the words offered little comfort. Symbols of the supernatural seemed to creep in, though no one dared to acknowledge them aloud. The clock on the wall froze at 3:15, its second hand ticking back and forth like a pendulum without moving forward. A glass of water left on the bedside table developed tiny cracks, its surface rippling as if disturbed by an unseen force. And then there were the shadows. They seemed to shift in the corners of the room, darker and more defined than they should have been under the harsh hospital lighting. For Clara's parents, the hours were agonizing. Her mother's prayers grew louder, her words tinged with frustration and sorrow. She was supposed to wake up, she whispered to no one in particular. Her father remained silent, but his hand gripped the edge of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. They both felt the strangeness in the air, though they couldn't put it into words. It was an unshakable sense that something wasn't right, that Clara's death wasn't the end of whatever had begun. By the 9th hour, word had spread through the hospital about the odd occurrences. Some dismissed it as hysteria, the result of grief and exhaustion. Others, particularly the older staff, muttered about things they'd heard in the past, stories of patients who didn't stay dead, of rooms that carried a weight long after tragedy struck. No one wanted to admit it, but the unease was contagious. Even Dr. Patel, a man of science through and through, found himself avoiding Clara's room whenever he could. As midnight approached, the storm outside reached its peak. Thunder roared, and lightning lit up the sky in jagged bursts. Inside the hospital, the power flickered, plunging the hallways into darkness for brief, jarring moments. When the lights came back on, a nurse passing by Clara's room swore she saw movement through the window. She paused, her heart pounding, but when she looked again, Clara was as still as ever. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Clara's body remained untouched, but the air around her seemed alive with something unexplainable. The flickering lights, the shifting shadows, the strange rhythmic vibrations beneath the floor, they all pointed to a presence that defied logic. And through it all, Clara's parents waited, caught between hope and despair, between belief and disbelief. By the 17th hour, the storm outside began to wane. The thunder grew distant, and the wind softened to a low, mournful wail. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere remained tense, the weight of the unexplainable pressing down on everyone who dared linger near Clara's room. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the strange occurrences stopped. The lights stabilized, the drafts disappeared, and the shadows returned to their rightful places. But the quiet that followed wasn't a relief. It was the kind of silence that screamed louder than any noise, a silence that carried with it the heavy sense that something had changed. Clara's parents clung to each other, their eyes fixed on the door to her room. They didn't know what they were waiting for, but they knew, deep in their hearts, that whatever came next would be unlike anything they'd ever known. Before we delve into what happened after those 17 hours, let's be clear, this was no ordinary death. It was the beginning of something far more unsettling, something that defied explanation and left everyone involved questioning what they thought they knew about life and death. Nobody could explain how Clara came back to life, but what happened next was even more unsettling. Her awakening changed everything. The sterile stillness of the hospital room was shattered in an instant. Her body, which had been cold and unmoving for hours, jerked violently upward. Her chest heaved as she let out a guttural scream that seemed to pierce through the walls. The sound was raw, primal, a noise that didn't belong in a place so orderly and controlled. Alarms on the monitors she had been disconnected from erupted, though they no longer served any function. The room, previously steeped in eerie silence, was suddenly alive with chaos. Her parents had been sitting vigil by her side, their eyes sunken and faces pale from hours of grief. Her mother let out a gasp, clutching her husband's arm with trembling hands. Her father, typically stoic, froze in place, his breath caught in his throat. Nurses and doctors rushed into the room, drawn by the scream that echoed down the corridor. They stopped in their tracks when they saw her. Once lifeless, now sitting upright on the hospital bed, her wide eyes darting around the room in terror. Her movements were erratic, almost unnatural. Her fingers clawed at the air as though trying to push away something unseen. Her breathing was ragged, and her mouth formed words, but no sound came out at first. It was as though her voice had been stolen during those 17 hours of death. Dr. Patel, who had seen his fair share of strange cases, stood dumbfounded. This wasn't in any textbook. This wasn't something medicine could explain. "Clara," her mother whispered, hesitant to believe her eyes. Her head snapped toward the voice, and for a brief moment there was recognition. But it was fleeting. Her expression quickly twisted into something unrecognizable, a mix of fear and anguish. Then came the convulsions. Her body thrashed against the bed as the medical team scrambled to hold her down. Her screams grew louder, each one more desperate than the last. The medical staff worked quickly to stabilize her. A nurse injected her with a sedative, and the thrashing slowed, though her trembling didn't stop. Dr. Patel ordered a battery of tests, his mind racing to find some logical explanation. Was this a misdiagnosis? Had they missed some critical sign of life? But the tests would take time, and time was something no one in that room seemed to have in abundance. When she finally calmed, the room fell into an uneasy quiet. Her parents leaned in close, their hands trembling as they reached for hers. Her mother's voice was soft, cracking under the weight of disbelief. "It's us. It's Mom and Dad." Her eyes fluttered open, her gaze unfocused. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "It was dark," she rasped. The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. "So dark." Her parents exchanged a worried glance, their relief at seeing her alive tempered by the weight of her words. The hospital staff began asking questions, trying to piece together what had happened, but her responses were fragmented, disjointed. "They were there," she muttered, her voice trembling. "They were waiting." When asked who they were, her face contorted with fear. "Don't let them take me back," she begged, gripping her mother's arm with surprising strength. The confusion in the room was palpable. Doctors scribbled notes, nurses whispered among themselves, and her parents hovered helplessly. The tension was thick, made worse by the lingering sense that something unexplainable was at play. Her words, though vague, painted a chilling picture. She spoke of a place void of light, where time didn't exist. She described voices, low, guttural whispers that seemed to seep into her very soul. "They were pulling me," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't stop them." Dr. Patel tried to maintain his composure, but even he couldn't hide the unease creeping into his thoughts. He ordered additional scans and tests, desperate to find a rational explanation. But deep down, he knew that science wouldn't provide the answers they sought. There was something about her awakening that defied logic, something that hinted at forces far beyond human understanding. As the night wore on, the strange phenomena around her seemed to intensify. The room's temperature fluctuated wildly, swinging from freezing cold to stifling heat. The flickering lights that had plagued the hospital earlier returned, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Her parents noticed these changes, but said nothing, their focus entirely on their daughter. But the staff couldn't ignore it. Whispers of supernatural began circulating among the nurses, though none dared say it aloud near Dr. Patel. Her fear didn't subside as the sedative wore off. If anything, it grew. She flinched at every sound, her eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "They're still here," she whispered at one point, sending a chill down her mother's spine. Her father, Ever the skeptic tried to reassure her. "You're safe. It's just us," he said, though his own voice wavered. But she shook her head. "You don't understand," she said, her tone urgent. "They're waiting, watching." By morning, the hospital was abuzz with rumors. Staff who hadn't even been assigned to her case found reasons to pass by her room, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had defied death. Her case became the talk of the town, with stories growing more exaggerated with each retelling. But for those in the room with her, the reality was unsettling enough. Dr. Patel decided to keep her under observation for another 24 hours, though he was unsure what they were observing for. Her vitals were stable, her brain activity normal, yet nothing about her condition felt ordinary. As the day wore on, she grew more withdrawn, her fear giving way to exhaustion. But even in sleep, her face remained tense, her body occasionally twitching as if trying to fend off unseen forces. Her parents stayed by her side, unwilling to leave her alone even for a moment. They took turns holding her hand, whispering words of comfort that sounded hollow even to their own ears. Whatever had happened during those 17 hours of death, it had left a mark, and though no one could see it, everyone in that room felt it. As night fell once again, the hospital seemed to hold its breath. The tension that had gripped the staff and her family didn't ease with the setting sun. If anything, it deepened, and as she stirred in her sleep, mumbling incoherent words that sounded like pleas, one thing became clear. Her awakening was just the beginning of a story far more chilling than anyone could have imagined. Her voice was barely a whisper when she first tried to speak about it. Her parents leaned in close, their expressions a mix of hope and dread. The hospital room, already thick with tension, seemed to grow heavier with every word she struggled to form. At first, the words didn't make sense, fragmented sentences about shadows and a place without time. But as she gained strength, her voice steadied, and what she said next left everyone in stunned silence. "It wasn't a dream," she began, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as though looking beyond it. "It was real, more real than this." She paused, her breathing uneven. "I was in a place that wasn't here. It was cold, but not like winter. It was the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, like it's pulling something out of you." Her parents exchanged a worried glance, but they didn't interrupt. Her hands trembled as she gripped the blanket tightly. "There were figures," she continued, her voice shaking. "They weren't people, not like us. They were tall and their faces were wrong, like they were trying to be human but couldn't quite get it right." The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the hum of the hospital equipment felt muted, as though the machines themselves were listening. Her eyes darted around the room, her fear palpable. "They didn't speak," she said, "but I knew what they wanted. They wanted me." Her mother gasped, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. Her father's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the chair. Dr. Patel, who had been silently observing, finally broke his professional demeanor. "What do you mean? Wanted you for what?" he asked, though his voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant. When she finally spoke, her words sent chills through everyone in the room. "They were waiting for me to follow," she said, "to go deeper. But there was something else, a light." Her tone shifted, a mix of awe and terror. "It wasn't like sunlight. It was blinding, but it didn't hurt to look at it. It was warm, and I wanted to go to it. I felt safe. But the figures, they didn't want me to. They tried to pull me back." The imagery she described painted a vivid, haunting picture, a realm of darkness populated by ominous figures and a distant light that offered both comfort and danger. Her parents listened in silence, their faces pale. Dr. Patel took notes, though his pen trembled in his hand. Her words seemed to defy explanation, but there was a clarity in her voice that made it impossible to dismiss as delirium. "There were gates," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Massive, made of something that shimmered like gold, but wasn't. They stood in the distance, behind the light. I knew if I passed through them, I wouldn't come back. But the figures, They wouldn't let me get close. They were pulling me towards something else, a void. Her words trailed off, and she began to sob softly. Her mother reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, though her voice wavered. "You're here now. You're safe." But she shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not safe. None of us are." The room fell silent again, her chilling declaration hanging in the air. Dr. Patel cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "What do you mean by that?" he asked carefully. "Why aren't we safe?" Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment it felt as though she was looking straight through him. "Because they're watching," she said. "They're always watching, and they don't forget." Her words sent shivers down his spine. He glanced at her parents, who looked equally disturbed. Her account was unlike anything he'd ever encountered, and yet there was an undeniable conviction in her voice. Whatever she had experienced during those 17 hours of death, it had left a mark, not just on her, but on everyone who heard her story. As the day wore on, she tried to explain more, but the details grew hazy. She spoke of whispers that echoed in the darkness, of hands that reached for her but never touched. "They're bound by something," she said at one point, her brow furrowed in thought. "Rules they can't break. But if we go to them, if we open the door—" She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Her parents pressed her for answers, desperate to understand, but she seemed to retreat into herself, as though speaking about it brought her closer to that dark place. By evening, she refused to talk altogether, her silence more unsettling than her words. Dr. Patel suggested letting her rest, though he doubted sleep would bring her peace. Before leaving the room, her father turned to Dr. Patel. "What do you think this is?" he asked, his voice low. "Is it trauma? Hallucinations?" Dr. Patel hesitated, his professional facade cracking. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it is, it's not something I can explain with science." As night fell, the hospital grew quiet again. Her parents stayed by her side, their hands clasped tightly. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an unspoken fear. And as she lay there, her eyes closed, her lips moved silently, forming words no one could hear. Her mother swore she saw a shadow pass across the room, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Whatever she had seen, whatever knowledge she now carried, it was clear that it wasn't meant for this world. And as the hours ticked by, a chilling thought settled over everyone who had heard her story. Some doors, once open, can never be closed. When Clara spoke about what she saw, her words sent chills through everyone who heard them. A light that couldn't be reached. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the hum of the hospital equipment felt muted, as though the machines themselves were listening. She sat upright in the hospital bed, her eyes hollow and haunted, as if she had aged decades in the span of days. Her hands trembled as she clutched the thin blanket, her voice cracking as she spoke. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic hum of machines monitoring her vitals, but no one was paying attention to the screens. "It's not what we think it is," she began, her voice low but steady. "The afterlife is not a paradise waiting for everyone. It's layered, divided, and judging." She paused, her words heavy with meaning. "I saw people, souls. They were trapped, their faces twisted with regret and sorrow. Some were crying out, but others didn't seem to realize they were there. They just wandered, lost in their own memories, replaying the same moments over and over." Her parents sat on either side of her, gripping her hands tightly as though anchoring her to the present. Her father's face was pale, his expression unreadable, while her mother's eyes brimmed with tears. Dr. Patel stood near the door, his notepad forgotten in his hands. None of them could interrupt. The weight of her words kept them frozen. "There was no rest," she continued, her voice growing more frantic. "No peace. It's like everything you've done follows you there. Every lie, every hurtful word, every selfish act. It's all there waiting for you, and you can't run from it. You can't hide." She shuddered, her grip tightening on the blanket. I felt it too, this weight, this pulling, like I was being dragged through my own worst moments. It was as if something wanted me to see, to understand. And then there were the others. Others? Her mother whispered, her voice trembling. She nodded. Beings, they weren't human, but they weren't like the figures in the dark either. They watched, they judged, they didn't speak, but I could feel their thoughts, their disappointment. They weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. It was as if they were waiting for me to realize something on my own. Her words sent a chill through the room. Even Dr. Patel, a man of science, found himself shifting uncomfortably. Her descriptions were vivid, far too detailed to dismiss as hallucinations or fever dreams, yet they defied everything he knew about the human mind and its limits. "What did they want you to see?" her father asked, his voice tight with emotion, her eyes filled with tears. "They wanted me to understand the cost of everything I've ever done. Every choice I made, every action I took, it rippled out, touching others in ways I never imagined. I saw people I'd hurt without even realizing it. I felt their pain as if it were my own. And then I saw hope, just a sliver of it, like a single thread in a tangled web. But it was there." Her voice broke, and she took a moment to steady herself. "They showed me what could be, what humanity could become if we chose differently, if we cared more, loved more, forgave more. But they also showed me what would happen if we didn't." The room was silent except for the sound of her labored breathing. Her words hung in the air, their meaning sinking in. She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze piercing. "It's not just about me," she said. "It's about all of us. We're being watched, judged, every moment of every day. And if we don't change..." She trailed off, her voice shaking. "The void," she whispered. "That's what waits for us. A place where everything is stripped away, your name, your memories, your very sense of self. It's not punishment, it's erasure, like you were never here at all." Her mother sobbed quietly, unable to hold back her tears. Her father's jaw clenched, his hands trembling. Dr. Patel finally spoke, his voice softer than usual. "Do you believe there's a way to avoid this void?" She nodded slowly. "They showed me a path. It's not easy, but it's there. It starts with us, with how we treat each other, how we live our lives. It's not about perfection, but intention. We have to try. We have to be better." Her words were both a plea and a warning. She wasn't just describing her experience, she was issuing a call to action. And though the room remained quiet, the weight of her message was impossible to ignore. As the hours passed, her energy waned. She leaned back against the pillows, her face pale and drawn. But even as exhaustion claimed her, her words lingered in the minds of those who had heard them. Her parents stayed by her side, their hands clasped tightly. Dr. Patel left the room, his thoughts racing with questions he couldn't answer. Her warning wasn't just for those in the hospital room, it was for everyone. And as the night wore on, one thing became clear. The choices humanity made from this point forward would determine far more than anyone realized. Her story spread far beyond the sterile walls of the hospital, carried by whispers, social media posts, and hushed conversations that traveled like wildfire. In the small town of Willowbrook, she became a figure of fascination overnight. Some saw her as a prophet, a chosen one who had glimpsed beyond the veil of life and returned with a warning. Others dismissed her as a tragic victim of delusion, her mind distorted by trauma and fever. The lines were quickly drawn, skeptics on one side, believers on the other, and she was caught in the middle. The media descended on Willowbrook, their cameras and microphones a constant presence outside the hospital. News anchors speculated wildly, their headlines veering between reverence and ridicule. "Woman claims to see afterlife," one headline blared, while another sneered, "medical mystery or fabrication." Her parents did their best to shield her from the chaos, but it was impossible to block out entirely. The hospital's phone lines were flooded with calls from reporters, scientists, and religious figures, all clamoring for an interview or a statement. Within the hospital, the reactions were no less polarized. Dr. Patel, ever the man of science, remained skeptical but respectful. "There's no denying she believes what she's saying," he told a colleague, "but belief doesn't equal reality. We need more data before drawing conclusions." Meanwhile, a nurse who had been in the room during her awakening confessed to feeling a profound shift in her own faith. "I can't explain it," she said, "but being there is like I felt something too." Religious leaders from various faiths weighed in, each interpreting her account through their own lens. A local pastor declared her experience a testament to the divine proof of heaven's existence. "She's been sent back to guide us," he proclaimed during his Sunday sermon, drawing an overflow crowd to the church. Conversely, a visiting rabbi cautioned against taking her words at face value, reminding his congregation of the complexities of the afterlife as described in Scripture. "We must seek wisdom," he said, "but not rush to conclusions." Scientists too entered the fray, eager to analyze her experience. Neurologists speculated about the brain's activity during near-death experiences, pointing to studies on oxygen deprivation and the release of endorphins. What she describes could easily be the result of her brain's attempt to process trauma, one researcher explained during a televised interview. But others were less dismissive, noting the unprecedented nature of her detailed recollections. "There's still so much we don't understand about consciousness," a psychologist admitted. "Her case deserves serious study." The clash between believers and skeptics reached her family as well. Friends and neighbors who had once offered quiet support now argued heatedly in their living room. One woman insisted her account was a miracle, while another scoffed, calling it the delusions of a traumatized mind. Her father, normally calm and composed, lost his temper during one particularly intense debate. "She's our daughter," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Whether you believe her or not, she needs us right now, not your opinions." Her mother tried to act as a buffer, gently ushering people out when the arguments grew too heated, but even she couldn't hide her growing frustration. "This isn't about proving anyone right or wrong," she told a neighbor one evening. "It's about helping her heal." Through it all, she herself remained quiet but resolute. The urgency in her voice when she spoke of her experience hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. She began writing down everything she remembered, filling pages with vivid descriptions and cryptic warnings. "They won't wait forever," she wrote in bold letters at the top of one page. Beneath it, a list of questions. Why are we here? What happens if we fail? Who decides? Despite her determination, she struggled with moments of doubt and despair. The skeptics' voices, though not always directed at her, were impossible to ignore. "What if they're right?" she asked her mother one night, her voice barely audible. "What if it was all in my head?" Her mother's response was gentle but firm. "You know what you saw," she said, "and no one can take that away from you." But the doubt lingered, a shadow that followed her even as she pushed forward. She agreed to a single interview, a televised segment that aired nationwide. The interviewer, a well-known journalist, approached the story with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Many people are calling your experience a miracle," she began. "Others say it's a hallucination. What do you say to them?" Her response was calm but unwavering. "I'm not here to convince anyone," she said. "I'm just here to tell the truth. What you do with it is up to you." The interview sparked even more debate, with pundits and social media users dissecting her every word. Supporters praised her bravery, while detractors accused her of seeking attention. Through it all, she maintained her focus. She wasn't interested in fame or validation. She was driven by a sense of purpose she couldn't fully explain. As the days turned into weeks, her urgency only grew. She began holding small gatherings in the hospital's chapel, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. The sessions were intimate, often emotional, as attendees grappled with the implications of her words. Some left feeling inspired, others unsettled, but no one left unchanged. "We have a choice," she told them, her voice steady despite the weight of her message. "Every day, we make choices that ripple out into the world. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying, about caring, because if we don't, she paused, her gaze sweeping the room. If we don't, we risk losing everything. The gatherings drew attention, both positive and negative. Local media covered them with a mix of intrigue and skepticism, while online forums buzzed with theories about her motives. Some accused her of exploiting people's fears, while others saw her as a beacon of hope in an increasingly chaotic world. Through it all, she remained steadfast. Her experience had changed her in ways she couldn't fully articulate, but one thing was clear: she couldn't stay silent. The message she carried was too important, too urgent to be ignored. And as the world around her continued to debate, to question, to believe or dismiss, she kept moving forward, her eyes fixed on a truth she couldn't unsee. Clara's warnings grew louder, and it felt like the dark thing she spoke about was getting closer. The prophecy that divided a town. Clara wasn't the same woman who had walked into the library on that crisp October evening. The experience had changed her in ways both profound and unsettling. Gone was the quiet, unassuming figure content with the routines of small-town life. In her place was someone driven, intense, and unrelenting, a woman who now seemed to view the world through a lens sharpened by urgency and fear. Her old habits fell away like leaves from a tree in winter, and with them went the comfort of familiarity. The changes were evident to everyone around her. Clara, who once relished solitude, began seeking out people wherever she could find them. She joined local meetings, attended community events, and even stood on street corners, handing out hastily written pamphlets. The papers carried cryptic warnings in bold lettering: "Time is running out," "Change now or face the void," and "Every choice matters." Her neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, their concern growing with each passing day. But it wasn't just her actions that unsettled them. It was her demeanor. Clara's once soft and measured tone had been replaced by a voice edged with conviction. She spoke quickly, her sentences tumbling over each other as though she feared she might run out of time. Her eyes, always kind and warm, now carried a piercing intensity that made it hard to look away or to look at her at all. Her family struggled to adapt to the new Clara. Her mother watched with a mix of worry and awe as her daughter abandoned her quiet routines. The nightly reading sessions by the window were replaced by hours spent poring over books on theology, philosophy, and quantum physics. Clara would scribble notes furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There has to be a connection," she muttered to herself one evening, surrounded by open volumes and scattered papers. Her father, ever practical, tried to reason with her. "Clara, you need to rest," he said one night, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You can't save the world on your own." Clara shook her head, her jaw set. "I don't have time to rest," she replied. "None of us do." Her intensity alienated some of her closest friends. People who had once adored her found themselves avoiding her calls and visits, unable to reconcile the woman they knew with the one who now seemed almost fanatical. Yet Clara didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she didn't care. She was consumed by a mission she couldn't fully articulate, a need to share what she had seen before it was too late. Reintegrating into normal life proved impossible. Clara's job at the library was waiting for her when she recovered, but she didn't return. The thought of cataloging books and chatting with patrons felt meaningless in the face of what she now knew. Instead, she spent her days traveling to neighboring towns, speaking at small gatherings, and handing out more of her pamphlets. Sometimes she was met with curiosity, other times with outright hostility. "She's lost her mind," someone said at a local diner one afternoon. "All that talk about the void and those beings is nonsense." Clara overheard the remark but didn't respond. Instead, she walked out into the chilly autumn air, her head held high. The disbelief of others didn't deter her. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. "They don't understand yet," she thought, "but they will." Her warnings grew more specific with time. At first, she had spoken in generalities about the importance of kindness, forgiveness, and love, but now her messages took on a darker tone. She spoke of a great reckoning, a point of no return where humanity's choices would determine its fate. The void isn't just for individuals, she said at one gathering. It's for all of us. Entire civilizations can be erased if they lose their way. These pronouncements unsettled even her most devoted listeners. Some began to wonder if Clara's visions were less divine and more the product of trauma. Others, however, hung on her every word, their own fears feeding into her apocalyptic warnings. A small but growing group of followers began accompanying Clara to her gatherings, treating her as a modern-day prophet. They called themselves the Watchers, and their presence only fueled the skepticism of those who doubted her. Clara's family became increasingly isolated as a result. Her parents, who had once been pillars of the community, found themselves shunned by neighbors who feared being associated with their daughter. "She's not crazy," her mother insisted during one particularly heated argument with an old friend. "She's just trying to help." But even her mother couldn't deny that Clara's behavior had become more erratic. She rarely slept, her nights consumed by writing and researching. She ate sparingly, her frame growing thinner by the day, and her warnings, once delivered with quiet urgency, had become impassioned pleas, her voice rising with desperation as she spoke of the consequences of inaction. The suspense around Clara's transformation reached a fever pitch one cold November evening. She had gathered a small crowd in a park, her breath visible in the crisp night air. Standing beneath a flickering street lamp, she delivered her most chilling warning yet. "They're watching," she said, her voice trembling. "Not just me, all of us. They're waiting to see if we'll change, and if we don't—" She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "The void will come for us all." A hush fell over the group, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. Some in the crowd looked away, unable to meet Clara's gaze. Others nodded solemnly, their faces pale. Whatever they believed about Clara's experience, her conviction was undeniable. And for those who listened, the question lingered. What if she was right? As the crowd dispersed, Clara stood alone under the street lamp, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer the Clara who had lived a quiet life in Willowbrook. She had become something else entirely, a messenger, a harbinger, a warning that couldn't be ignored. The night of Clara's final gathering began with an air of unease. A storm loomed in the distance, its thunder rolling softly like an ominous drumbeat. Clara stood at the center of the town square, her thin frame illuminated by the glow of streetlights. Her followers, the Watchers, formed a loose circle around her, their eyes wide with anticipation. Onlookers gathered at a cautious distance, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Everyone knew this night would be different. Clara had promised a revelation, one that would change everything. Clara's voice was hoarse, strained from weeks of relentless speaking and sleepless nights. Yet as she began to speak, it carried an intensity that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "You've all felt it," she began, her eyes scanning the faces before her. "The sense that something is coming, that the world as we know it is hanging by a thread. I've seen what lies beyond, and I'm here to tell you, we're out of time." A gust of wind swept through the square, carrying with it a chill that made the crowd shiver. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles white. "They've given me one last message," she continued, her voice breaking. "One final chance to warn you. If we don't change, if we don't choose love, compassion, and forgiveness, the void will consume us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. The Watchers nodded solemnly, their belief unwavering, but from the edges of the crowd came whispers of doubt. "She's lost it," someone muttered. Another scoffed. "Just more fear-mongering." Clara ignored the dissent, her focus unshaken. "I've seen what's coming," she said, her voice rising. "A great shadow will fall over this world. It will come suddenly, without warning, and it will strip away everything we thought we knew. Only those who have opened their hearts will stand a chance. The rest—" She paused, her breath hitching. The rest would disappear, erased as if they never existed. The storm edged closer, lightning flashing in the distance. A low rumble of thunder followed, reverberating through the square. Some in the crowd looked to the sky uneasily, while others fixed their gaze on Clara, captivated by her every word. Her body began to shake, whether from exhaustion or something more, no one could tell. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breathing grew labored. "You have to listen," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "This isn't about me. It's about all of us. They're watching, waiting to see if we'll make the right choice. But the window is closing. The storm is not just weather. It's a sign." As if on cue, the first raindrops began to fall. They pattered softly at first, then harder, the storm unleashing its fury. Clara's followers rushed to cover her, but she pushed them away, stepping into the rain. "I won't stop," she said, her voice barely audible over the growing din. "Not until you understand." And then it happened. A brilliant flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the square in stark white. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The crowd froze, their faces illuminated with an almost otherworldly glow. And then came the thunder, a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. Clara fell to her knees, clutching her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her eyes rolled back as she collapsed onto the wet pavement. Gasps and cries erupted from the crowd, and several people rushed forward to help. But as they reached her, a strange, unexplainable phenomenon occurred. The streetlights flickered wildly before going out entirely, plunging the square into darkness. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, like the vibration of some immense, unseen force. Those closest to Clara swore they saw a faint glow emanating from her body, a soft golden light that pulsed with each labored breath. When the lights returned, Clara was lying still, her face pale but serene. Her followers surrounded her, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. "She's not gone," one of them whispered. "She's transcended." Dr. Patel, who had reluctantly attended the gathering out of concern for Clara's health, knelt beside her and checked for a pulse. It was faint but steady. "She needs medical attention," he said firmly, waving for paramedics who had been standing by. As they lifted her onto a stretcher, Clara's eyes fluttered open. She looked directly at Dr. Patel and whispered 3 words: "The shadow comes." Her words sent a chill through him, and for the first time he felt a crack in his skepticism. The storm raged on as the ambulance drove away, its sirens barely audible over the howling wind. In the square, the crowd remained, their whispers growing louder. Some declared the night a miracle, proof of Clara's prophecy. Others dismissed it as coincidence, an unfortunate culmination of weather and hysteria. But as the storm began to subside, one thing was clear. No one who had witnessed the events of that night would ever forget them. Clara's revelation had shaken them to their core, leaving behind a lingering question that none dared to voice aloud. What if she was right? Clara's life after that stormy night was a blur of uncertainty and speculation. She spent weeks recovering in the hospital, her body worn down from the strain of her relentless warnings. Visitors came and went, some seeking hope, others simply curious to catch a glimpse of the woman who had stirred a town, and perhaps something greater. But Clara herself grew quieter, retreating into a stillness that unnerved even her most devoted followers. The watchers continued to spread her message, organizing gatherings and sharing her words with anyone willing to listen. They insisted that Clara's prophecy was not just a warning, but a blueprint for salvation. "She's shown us the path," one follower said during an impromptu interview. "Now it's up to us to walk it." But others were less convinced. A renowned psychologist appeared on a national news program to discuss Clara's case, dismissing her experiences as the product of severe trauma. Her brain was deprived of oxygen, he explained, and the vivid imagery she describes is consistent with near-death experiences. It's compelling, yes, but it's not evidence of anything supernatural. These debates played out across media platforms, dividing public opinion. Religious leaders cited Clara's story as proof of divine intervention, while skeptics called her a fraud or a tragic figure consumed by delusion. Clara herself avoided the spotlight, her days spent in quiet reflection. Her parents shielded her from the noise, though they couldn't escape it entirely. One afternoon, a journalist managed to arrange an interview with Clara's mother. Sitting at the kitchen table, she spoke hesitantly, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. "I don't know what she saw," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but I know my daughter. She believes every word she said, and if you'd seen her face when she woke up that day, you'd believe her too." Others in the town shared similar sentiments. A nurse who had been present during Clara's initial revival described the moment as unlike anything I've ever seen. She paused, her eyes distant. There was something in that room. I can't explain it, but I felt it. Despite the support, Clara's detractors remained vocal. A local scientist organized a public lecture to debunk her claims, using diagrams and data to explain the mechanics of near-death experiences. "There's no evidence of an afterlife," he concluded, his tone firm. "What Clara experienced was extraordinary, yes, but it was a product of biology, not divinity." Through it all, Clara remained an unsolved question. She spoke sparingly, her once passionate warnings reduced to murmured phrases that left even her closest followers confused. "It's already begun," she said once, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We just don't see it yet." The ambiguity of her words only fueled the debate. Some saw her silence as proof of her authenticity, believing that she was preparing for something greater. Others dismissed it as a sign that her conviction was fading. Months later, Clara disappeared from the public eye entirely. Her parents, protective as ever, refused to disclose her whereabouts. Rumors spread. Some claimed she had moved to a secluded cabin to live in solitude, while others insisted she had joined a confidential group preparing for the apocalypse. A tabloid even published an unverified story about Clara being taken into custody by a shadowy government agency. For those left behind, her absence was both a relief and a question. The Watchers continued their work, though their influence waned without Clara's presence. Skeptics moved on to other stories, their disbelief undiminished. But for those who had been touched by her message, Clara's absence only deepened their resolve. 1 year to the day after her stormy revelation, a strange event occurred. In the town square where Clara had delivered her prophecy, the streetlights began to flicker just after sunset. Witnesses described an unnatural stillness that settled over the area as though the world itself were holding its breath. Then, without warning, a deep, resonant hum filled the air. It lasted only a few seconds, but left those present shaken. "It was just like that night," one man said, his voice trembling. "The storm, the lights, it's happening again." The incident sparked a renewed interest in Clara's story. Her followers declared it a sign, proof that her warnings had been real all along. Skeptics dismissed it as a coincidence, a technical glitch, amplified by collective paranoia. But for the people of Willowbrook, the event left an indelible mark. It was a reminder of the woman who had challenged them to question everything they thought they knew about life, death, and what lay beyond. The narrative remained open-ended, a story without resolution. Clara's name became a symbol, invoked in debates about faith and science, truth and delusion. Whispers of her claims found their way into quiet conversations and academic papers, spreading like ripples in a pond. Some saw her as a visionary, while others dismissed her as a tragic figure lost to her own convictions. And as the world continued to turn, one question lingered in the minds of those who had heard her story. What if she was right? Was her warning just the result of a strange medical phenomenon? Or did she truly glimpse something terrifying beyond death that we're not ready to face? Tell us what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.